think I'd like to move to the next speaker, Dr. Gary Bell, who got his PhD from Carleton, and I'm wondering, were you one of Gray's students?
No, I wasn't one of Gray's students, but Gray was on my committee for my master's and PhD and was my chairman of my review committee for my PhD.
Right. You've all got mini bios in the introductory, in this sheet, and so I'm not going to say too much more about Gary, except that he's had a long and distinguished career with the U.S. Nature Conservancy, and now we're very glad to welcome him back to Canada, to the Canadian Nature Conservancy, where he is responsible for Eastern Ontario. Gary Bell.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Gray. We do take shortcuts in our conservation work in terms of terminology. And if I catch myself saying connectivity instead of connectedness, you can just lean over and swat me. And I would also say, these are my caveats. I feel like I'm representing a phone company, a cell phone company, presenting our new model, because it doesn't really exist yet. But I'm going to give you the results of our Natural Area Conservation Plan for the Ottawa Valley, which won't really be completed until this coming week, hopefully early week. And it's a complex analysis and a complex project and had lots of technical problems, but in particular the biggest technical problem is that both the National Capital Commission and the Nature Conservancy of Canada use the same acronym for their name, and it's made it almost impossible for us to move forward. So the Nature Conservancy of Canada, by way of introduction, has been around for 50 years. We do land conservation. We do much of it through land acquisition. Since our founding, we've protected something on the order of 2.6 million acres across the country. We use private and public funds leveraged against each other to acquire key properties. And we base all of our work to the best we are able on available science. And so we like to think of ourselves as science-driven, and that may be overstated, but we try to use the best available information to make our conservation decisions. We say we're the Nature Conservancy of Canada, but in fact, what we really do is we work on the southern fringe of the country, really along the U.S. border, where the impacts of human development are most prominent. So we're working to do our conservation in the fragmented portion of the Canadian landscape. And as I said, our work is scientifically driven, and we use conservation planning at all levels of our work. And we start with what we call ecoregional plans up at the high level. We drill down on local areas through what we call natural area conservation plans. And then we do property management plans for the properties we actually acquire and manage. And for all of those, we use very similar suites of data on conservation targets like imperiled species, endemic species, all the natural communities. And we try where we can to set specific goals for those targets. And that's the same whether we're talking about an ecoregional plan or a property management plan, or what I'm going to talk to you about very briefly today is our Natural Area Conservation Plan and the Conservation Plan for the Ottawa Valley. And these Natural Area Conservation Plans for us are really a business plan. Our ecoregional plans are very ethereal, this would be a great outcome kind of a thing that says, what would conservation success look like on the landscape? How do you achieve protection of all the biodiversity of an ecoregion? But it's not a very practical plan to get you working on the ground. So our natural area conservation plans identify a particular subset of the landscape and focus in on what can the Nature Conservancy of Canada and its partners do most specifically to achieve conservation ends based on the targets that we select and the data that we're able to pull up to identify those targets. Interesting. I didn't realize that was going to happen, and for the sake of speed, I'm just going to pop those down. This particular natural area conservation plan, as many of our plans run, is really done in partnership with the City of Ottawa and with the National Capital Commission and with a bunch of other organizations, Ministry of Natural Resources, who've all helped us get where we are. These plans, these are the components of our plans. So we set the conservation context, we identify our targets, we identify threats to those targets on the landscape, we set goals for each of our targets, and we try to come up with a set of conservation actions that lead us to specific outcomes on the ground. So the conservation context for the Ottawa Valley, probably everybody in this room, or most people in this room, could spell out as well or better than I can and would come up with a different set. But for us, it's really, what makes it interesting, fascinating, unique, rich, is that it's an overlap of ecoregions, the Boreal, the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence lowlands, and all of these influences sucked up from the south out of the northern Appalachians and the Allegheny. So it's a blend, well, as most areas are, I guess, there's a lot of areas are. It's a blend of ecoregions. It lies in the Great Rift Valley, the Ottawa Graben, and which became the bed of the Champlain Sea, which has created unique features and landscapes and habitats. It's a key area for biological diversity for both Ontario and Quebec. It contains the largest and most, this is something I didn't know before we did this plan, the largest and most extensive karst formations in Ontario. One of the highest densities of rare species, I already said that. And it's particularly rich in reptiles, amphibians, birds, fishes, and mussels. It's an important area for grassland birds, something a lot of people don't realize, and maybe not really for the best reasons, but they're the reasons we have. And something I find myself saying over and over again when I talk about different natural areas, the greatest threat is fragmentation. Sound good to you?
Repeat.
Same thing. So these are the conservation targets that we selected to drive the outcome of our natural area plan. And they really fall into two different sets. And in the end, it kind of surprised me what we ended up deciding on in our conservation actions. And obviously, I'm going to come back to that. There's the matrix systems that are the landscape. This is the 80-20 rule, working at the conservation planning scale. It's actually like the 90-10 rule. The forest matrix, the wetland matrix, the rivers and the riparian systems are 90% of the landscape, of the natural landscape, have 90% of the biodiversity, and for the Ottawa Valley, and again I'll come back to that, it's the hardest part to protect because it is so fragmented, as Gray has said. The second set of targets are the stuff that falls through the cracks if you try to do your conservation at the matrix level. And for the Ottawa Valley, the ones we selected are the karst, alvar, the limestone special rare systems, karst, cave systems, alvar ecosystems, dunes and sandy barrens. The Champlain Sea left us with enormous sand plains, ancient sand dunes, and we know very little about them and have done very little to protect them. And they are, in and of themselves, these little pockets of rare diversity that aren't found anywhere else. And then, as I mentioned before, grassland birds that for us present a bit of a problem because the Nature Conservancy of Canada isn't a rare species organization, we're a land conservation organization. We believe that if you protect landscapes, protect natural habitats and the processes that maintain them, the biodiversity should look after itself. But in the case of grassland birds, the grassland birds are living in an agricultural landscape. It's not something we really involve ourselves in, but it's clearly an issue because grassland birds have been so reduced North America-wide that they do not allow any of us to ignore their plight. So, very briefly, just to go through our mapping from our plan of the targets. The previous plan that I worked on was the Frontenac Arch, which is the most heavily forested natural area in southern Ontario. It's still 78% natural cover, 65% of that is forest cover. By contrast, the Ottawa Valley is chopped up and fragmented. With the exception of the Pontiac Plain in Quebec, it's all chopped up into little woodlots, with the exception of a few big patches that remain. Trying to link them together, and again, I'll come back to this, is going to be difficult. This is showing the limestone systems, limestone plain habitats in the natural area. Little green dots are alvar communities. There's a bunch of them on the Quebec side. There's a few on the Ontario side. And the purple are known karst, the dark purple are known karst, and the slashed purple are implied karst, and there's still a lot of karst system to be discovered in the Ottawa Valley. The sand plain, as mentioned, sand plain features, but only a very few known dunes or extant dunes. And grassland birds, lots of grassland birds. They follow the river, follow the agricultural areas. For our targets, we go through a process of determining viability based on size of the population or the size of the system, the condition that it's in, and its context, its ecological context. Not just connectedness, but also the intactness of ecological processes. And when we run this kind of target viability for the Frontenac Arch for comparison, it's all green. It's all good and well, almost all good and very good. And the viability of the overall system of the natural area for the Frontenac Arch is good, but it's only fair for the Ottawa Valley, which means it needs input, it needs help, it needs conservation work if these systems and these processes and these species are going to survive into the future. And we elucidate the threats, and there's a whole list of them, and I'm not going to go through them, for each target. And these are kind of pulled from experience and literature and thin air, but they give us a picture. And we would say that for most of the threats across the natural area, things are medium. And medium, again, means in the same sense as fair for a target means that it needs input, medium for a threat means it is acting immediately on our species, on our systems. Things aren't really bad, but without some kind of intervention in the future, it's going to have a greater and greater impact on those targets, and something will need to be done. And so what we do is, for our targets, having identified the viability, having identified the threats against them, and doing all of this in a spatial mapping context, we break up the landscape into cells. For each cell, we identify where are our targets in that cell, what is the viability of that target in that cell, and what's the immediate threat against them in that particular location. And we use that to try to meet our goals for this landscape. And this is what tells us in this mapping exercise, where should we work? Where are the opportunities to do good conservation work, and where could we work to meet the goals in the natural area for these targets? And what we end up with is a set of priorities. Sometimes when we do this mapping, we base it on property parcels. In this case, we did it based on 400 hectare cells. And maybe there's no surprise here. I don't think there's really any surprise here. We know that from Alfred Bog over to Mer Bleu, there's some pretty good intact habitats around these big bog systems and fen systems. We know that around Marlborough Forest, there's a lot of intact wetland and some intact forest. And again, we know the Pontiac Plain is pretty intact in terms of forest. Everything else, priority 1, priority 2 means, well, we'll spend some money there if that's what achieves connectivity, but these aren't really the highest priority parcels where we should focus first. So the red stuff is where we should focus first in putting things together. Now, what we've started doing in our natural area plans, and the first time we did it in Eastern Ontario was in our last iteration of the Frontenac Arch Plan, is doing a connectedness analysis. And we've been, for these plans, we've been doing what's called a least cost path analysis, which says if you're going to get from point A to point B on the landscape, given the threats, given the habitat, given the targets, what's the easiest way of getting there? And what that can do in a mapping exercise is tell you where you should focus your resources. Where should I buy my parcels if I'm going to buy land to connect? What's the best place to do that? And there's a number of different ways of doing this kind of analysis. And this is hot out of the hopper of the computer from Friday. And this is really unimpressive. And I've been struggling with this. This is more impressive actually than the first version. But what we've come up with is, what we said was, we want to get, what's the best way to get from Alfred Bog to the Gatineau? And what's the best way to get from the Gatineau to the top end, say Sheenborough on the Quebec side? And what's the best way to get from the Gatineau down to the southern end, through Marlborough Forest to the southern end? And, well, there's these big, by the way, these are not corridors. That wasn't, I didn't, these are not corridors. So what you have to realize, when we do this mapping and it works, what this says is, if there's, this is a better example than these two. If I'm going to get from here to here, this is where I should look for big parcels that make that connection. But what these corridors, what these connectedness maps show me is that it doesn't say that these are great lands to buy to make that connection. It just says they're all the same value. The world is your oyster. Go out, and if you want to connect that to that, go out and buy a whole bunch of land and it'll be connected. And going one way is just as good as going any other way. So there's a lot of more thinking, I think, required to think about the connectivity issue for us. So here's what we came up with, and this is the meat and potatoes of a natural area plan for us. These are our goals and actions to come out of the plan. So we are going to step back initially from the whole idea of working on matrix systems and forests until we have a little bit better idea of where to go and a little bit more information on resources. So we want to focus on high priority lands, focusing on karst system, sand dunes, and grassland birds, and bogs and fens, because those are high conservation priority. We know where they are, we know how to negotiate on them, and we could make something really good happen for all of those systems. We'll similarly work with partners to acquire key parcels by providing financial resources where we can to make good things happen through partnership. We want to promote science-based conservation planning for existing lands, because there's lots of existing conservation lands in this natural area that have no management plan in place. And we can help make that happen. So that's something that the Nature Conservancy of Canada can do. We want to promote more community awareness and interest in the Ottawa Valley and conservation there. And finally, we want to promote strategic partnerships, because I say we're not going to get involved in the matrix systems and connecting those forests, but maybe through our partnership with Environment Canada and with the city's resources and their thinking about landscape connectivity, and with the National Capital Commission and their thinking about landscape connectivity, we could bring resources together to make some really big projects happen that would make a big difference for that. But here's where we have 3 planning efforts that might come together and have a really good outcome in the end, and that's what I'm hoping for. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. Little questions? Yes, in the white.
Gary, I noticed that when you identified some of the conservation targets, you had the rivers in riparian, which showed only there, but then I didn't see it in your actions. so much reflected. So,
Just like the,
question.
well, and it's the same thing. There are some actions that relate to that in our bigger action table, but it doesn't weigh heavily in our outcomes. The rivers are a matrix system, just like the forests and just like the big wetlands, and so we're going to focus more on the little stuff while we sort out the big stuff. It's essentially what we're saying.
Venya.
Another question. The alvars and the sand dunes are really spotted. They're hardly connected, not like forest systems or
They're
rivers.
exactly that. They perhaps were connected, but things have grown up to such an extent that they're no longer connected. They're islands essentially.
Yeah.
So maybe I shouldn't have mentioned them in a session on connectivity, but we're really talking about island conservation when we're talking about protecting those systems.
Time for one more question? Yes.
You don't mention the connection between Canadian shield habitats. So you may know of the Carp Hills, which is virtually an island in between the Canadian shield on the other side of the Gatineau, of the Ottawa River, Gatineau Park, and then all the way out, starts again up in Alwan. Any notions about the Carp Hill? That's a huge area, and it's being developed at the speed of a locomotive.
Not really. It's what I can say is it's something we really discussed as a team going through this. And as you say, there's a number of these which are like alvars, they're islands. The Carp Hills, Wolf Grove. These are islands of granite in the middle of a limestone sea, and they're fabulous, fabulous rich conservation values. We looked at those systems as part of the matrix, and maybe what we need to do is go back in the future and think of them as islands instead, and look at their particular values outside of the forest matrix question.